We've been thinking for a number of weeks around the topic of wealth and what the scriptures have to say about it, how they interact with the message of Christianity. And we're coming now to a conclusion where I hope, having travelled through it and having considered how God is the source of everything that we have, we considered a few key characters, the rich young ruler, and of course the really tragic man from Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament who has everything in the world, certainly all the money and material, but not a heart in very good condition. And where I'd like to finish up, and I hope that you'll see it's a suitable conclusion, is that in some sense, the more that we understand the paradigm that God gives us for wealth and material and so on, is that it's really got very little to do with money in its essence. And it's actually all about the condition of our hearts. And I think that's what 1 John speaks to us about. When we're driving and we're in a car, we have a field of vision, and with the way cars have evolved for safety, we now have several mirrors, and they help us increase our field of vision. So we're able to see a bit more, we're able to drive a bit more safely, and quite often if there's an accident and an insurance claim, there's a real contest over what is in someone's field of vision. You all know about the blind spot. You had to learn about it incessantly when you were training to drive for your test. And if something is in that blind spot or outside of your field of vision, then something might not be considered as relevant to an accident in terms of blame and cause. And 1 John is trying to, if you like, expand his readers and his audience's field of vision to make the Lord Jesus Christ take up the most of it and put others in it as much as possible in line with Jesus' own central message about how he summed up the entire of the law and the prophets, was to love God and to love neighbour as oneself. And he's trying to correct a distortion in his day, which is to narrow that field of vision to oneself, particularly in the spiritual realm, to make it about one's own spiritual experience. You see, what he was battling against, and we're battling it in a different form in our culture, but what he was battling against was this idea that in order to be spiritual or close to God, you had to work really hard to get this secret knowledge and this pipeline, which was a communication between yourself, your own heart, and God. And you could sort of go into a mystical cabin and you could know more of God, and that would take you closer to God, and that would make you spiritually elite, like the Olympic athletes of the spiritual realm. And John's making many points which are deceptively look like they're very simple. He's got a very complicated way, actually, of structuring the book. But his point is that is so misleading, because to put yourself at the center of the field of vision is to miss the point entirely of spirituality. Spirituality is entirely practical and is deeply focused on others and on their well-being. If you like, John's point here is that spirituality consists of really divesting oneself of things in order that others might flourish. So I hope we're going to see that. Now, I did say that John's book is deceptively complicated. It's one of those letters that it reads really simple and the language is really simple and accessible. But then when you sit down in the middle of the week to study it and to preach on it, you're seeing, oh my goodness, this is much, maybe I should have chosen another text to illustrate this. He's got the ideas of God being light, being love, and being life, and of us as his people being able to participate in that cycle of love, light, and life. That, if you like, that's the major broad brush strokes of the book of John. And he's trying to show how everything is encompassed under that in one's life. And what he does here is he takes his readers to the source of their life and asks them to consider that. And that's what I want to do. So I don't have 2 or 3 points as I normally would, because I didn't think the text really suited it. What I want to do is trace the contours of John's argument from where he's saying, look at where you are, let's go back to the source of where that is, and then I want to try and consider just how we apply that in terms of what is the the source that is operating of our life and our decisions and our impulses and all of that. So, perhaps counterintuitively, I hope this makes sense, and I hope it will make sense, but let's have a go at it. We'll start at the end of the passage where John says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or with speech, but with actions and in truth." Now, that's a really simple idea. That could almost be a proverb, a bit like Elizabeth read for us in the Old Testament, and I think we could all attest to the fact that that's quite accessible. We don't want to love merely with our words. We don't merely want to say to people, "I love you." We want to demonstrate it. He's arguing against a kind of sentimentality where we, the sort of not Hallmark, that's American, the Clinton's Cards version of love, which is easy because you can just pay £3 for it and there you go. I love you, but do you unload the dishwasher? Let's see some actions that actually back that up. Do you pick up after yourself? That kind of thing. Okay, so we can all access that. We don't want any sentimentality. But how has he gotten there? Well, he's got a slightly more serious dichotomy. If anyone, verse 17, has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Now, we start to get phrases that are somewhat arresting. That is quite a controversial stake and claim, that it's impossible for the love of God to be in somebody if they're able to easily walk on by from somebody in need. Now, look at the way he structures it. This is not, it is impossible, and some of us temperamentally are prone to guilt and to always feeling bad that we can't do enough, and we're sort of the world's helpers, if you like. Think of the field of vision when you're driving. He's talking about people that are coming into your field of vision, because none of us can do everything everywhere all the time, no matter how much we want to help. But he's thinking, who is in your field of vision? Who is in your circle of potential influence that you might be able to do something about, to divest yourself of something in order that they might be helped and they might be able to either survive for that day or just flourish a little bit? That is a tangible evidence of the love of God at work in your life. But John's always working in the sort of the both and. He's saying not only is that proof of the love of God, but the absence of that is a cause for alarm in terms of an absence of the love of God working through one's heart and life. And then he says, because I'm always fond of saying to you, Christianity is not a religion or a collection of moralisms or imperative to just do something for its own sake, even trying to say it's just the right thing to do. Everything in our faith comes back to the example and the command and the love that God has already demonstrated and shown us in Jesus Christ. And that's where John goes in verse 16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. So he's gone from sentimentality not being enough to making sure that those within our influence and vision are helped, to the why, to the, look, I'm giving you the best and the supreme reason for this. It's because the person that we're all collected here to gather around and worship and venerate, he did this. And he didn't have to, but he chose to lay down his life to divest himself of the glory and the riches that he enjoyed in heavenly splendor, and to live in poverty and to struggle and to suffer for you. He did that for you, and that's why we're asking you to do that for others. And he's showing that that's the, if you like, that's the train or the path that the love of God takes. From its source, it flows, and it is concerned with sacrifice of oneself for others, and it's looking to build others up and give them life. And then he says, but let's look at the other course in verse 15. Anyone who hates his brother or sister is a murderer. That strikes us as very strong language. And you know that no murderer has eternal life residing within him. Just as there is no life within the murderer, so there is no love within the miser, is a proverbial way of putting it. That he's making an argument that people act and play out the contents of their heart, of their inner being, of who they are. There's a saying in my generation's culture now that when somebody shows you who they are, believe them. And there's some truth to that. I mean, part of Christianity is about being charitable and giving the benefit of the doubt, but there is enormous stock and wealth in actually looking to, and Christianity gives us paradigms for this, and looking to people's actions in order that we might know the contents of their heart. In some sense, that's the only test that we can know, because we can't see into people's heart. We know that we've passed from death to life because we love each other. And then he takes it to, if you like, the most dramatic and stark example that he can give, as John is somebody who is versed in the Old Testament and the Jewish scriptures, and a good number of his audience will be too. He goes back to their founding story, if you like. Not the garden and the tree as we thought about earlier, but just after that, in Genesis chapter 4, the awful story of the bloodlust of Cain and his brother Abel. And he ruminates on that, and he shows how it's connected to his idea of what the source of what we do is. Don't be like Cain, he says, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? He gives the reason. Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. And so do not be surprised if the world hates you. We've passed from death to life because we love each other. What's at the center of all this? He's saying there's two sources for living, and there are only two. That there is the source of death and decay, hatred, murder, evil, envy, jealousy, that motivated Cain, that made him kill his brother. And there is the source of life, which flows from God himself. It's most clearly demonstrated for us through Christ. And then it is possible through Christ to go from one to the other. In fact, he's claiming that that's the central experience of Christianity, is to come from that one of decay, darkness, and death, and to come to the life and experience of being in God and imitating the Lord Jesus. Okay, now, and that's something we don't meditate on very much, is that there are these two ways of being in the world. But that's absolutely central and fundamental to what John is saying. So let's look at those sources, because there's a few of them in the text, and if we can personify them, maybe it'll help us hang on to them, consider which ones we might be in, and consider what God might be calling us to in light of that. Because our worship and our wealth, all of those things are just tenets of our life, and all of those things flow out from the heart. Jesus himself said, out of the heart comes all the bad stuff, the evil, adultery, the jealousy, the murder, and so on. And Proverbs says that we're to guard our heart because it is the wellspring of our life. This is where everything really resides and starts, whether that's our approaches to money or to wealth, to any kinds of possessions, to how we see and treat other people, and our whole way of being in the world. Cain in the story is kind of, now that we're back at the start, is his first character. He says, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. Jewish scholars thought that the devil was actually the direct father through their kind of oral tradition, was the father of Cain, because how else could you commit such a cold, bloodthirsty, heinous act unless the devil himself was motivating you and acting upon you? And I think the reason John chooses Cain to, if you like, shock his audience is that he wants them to consider that there's a source and a pool of all that stuff that is the same. Because I think we would all consider ourselves fairly civilized, and that we wouldn't even contemplate or dream of murder. And as we considered in the Sermon on the Mount a month or so back, the demands of Christianity are just so much higher than that in terms of the ethics. It's saying it's not enough that you're not an active murderer. It's to recognize the connection between that and wishing for someone else's downfall, or being so concerned with your self-preservation, and because he's linking Cain to the person who just passes by and isn't really interested in the plight of somebody that isn't empathetic towards somebody who's struggling. He's saying there's a continuum, there's a pipeline from that to murdering and hating somebody to that extent. Now let me just circle on that a wee bit more to try and elucidate it if I can. It's not that murdering somebody and taking their life is the same thing as wishing for their downfall or not wishing for the best for them. They're obviously not in terms of their severity. But if we're considering the heart and trying to think, well, how can I get my heart to flourish? How can I do an audit and see if it's in the best possible condition? He's saying if you hate or despise someone, or if you want to pull them down, or if you're so concerned about your own well-being needs, what will happen to your portfolio of whatever you have, stuff in this world, that you're thinking, actually, I'm going to hold back from some kindness and generosity because, what would that mean for me? Then he's saying, you're in that source and stream of pollution that made Cain take his brother out. Do you see? He's actually connecting it. And he's saying that's not a good place to be. It's a dreadful place to be. This isn't about money, because without heart, some of us might be in the position where we could lavishly help someone financially or not. But we all have a heart that is filled up with the capacity to love and care for and bless others, particularly with our affections. Okay? We have a wealth of love that we're able to tap into, which is the very love of God. And we have a choice all the time whether we're going to actually look to give that out and help and build others up. Whether we're going to celebrate others' success, or whether we're going to be jealous of them and worry about it, because if they do well, then that means, well, what does that mean for us? Can you see how now we're getting to, my goodness, that this affects nearly every human being, because that's a struggle for a lot of us. Our natural inclination and the society and the culture we're born into tells us you need to look out for yourself, you need to make sure that you're going to be okay, you need to try and achieve and dominate and succeed in your own path, because there might not be enough success or even love or affection to go around. Some of the most horrible people in life are people that were very early on starved of critical nurture and affection as children, and as a result, they are constantly worried that there is not going to be enough for them, and so they act in rather grandiose and self-obsessed ways. The author Dallas Willard says that in terms of the field of view, that they are predominant in their own field of vision, and that's how they act out their life. And we all know people like that. And maybe you're convicted that you can be a bit like that, because we all exist on that continuum of, well, I'm going to try and take care of myself, because what if there isn't enough resources for me to be taken care of? And then it gets to an even more, if you like, pathological form that Cain shows for us. Why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Where this can end up is, and we might not end up murdering, but we might end up trying to sabotage. Because if we know within ourselves deep down, and I think a lot of us do know ourselves deep down, if we know that we are not on the right path, we're insecure, and we're worried about whether we're doing the right thing or whether we are actually lovable people and all of that, when we see somebody who is just doing their thing, they seem free, they're loving others well, they're almost a mirror of what we should be, and they're reflecting back to us what we're deficient in. That's the real sort of dynamic between Cain and Abel, and that's what John's zeroing in on. The problem that Cain had was he could see what he was not and what he ought to be, and it drove him insane. And rather than do the self-reflective work of going, well, why am I like that? Why am I offering God my very best? Why? It was, I'm going to get rid of him because I cannot handle what that is doing to me and how bad that is making me feel about myself. And it wasn't that Cain was doing anything wrong. You see, this can manifest in 1,000 different ways, and it's all connected to the same source: active murder, or just unhealthy jealousy, or deep insecurity, which I think is a massive problem in our world and culture. And it all circles around this drain of hatred, self-hatred quite often at the bottom of it, but then hatred for others, and wanting to take life, and wanting to steal and grab it because we're worried there's not going to be enough, so we need to take from the pot of other people's life rather than giving away our own. We're nowhere near in the place where we can give away of ourselves because we're so worried about ourselves. A lot of people in that position in our world today. And then we have Abel, who is there. His brother's actions were righteous. And then he links that in verse 13 to, do not be surprised then if the world hates you. Now, I think this is really hopeful that's tucked in the middle of it, because he's saying, see, if you're one of those people that has a wealth of worship in your heart towards God, and you're generous, and you look to love and serve and give to God with what you have, and you look to give away the goodness of your life for others because you know that you're planted in the love of God, good on you. But sometimes you're going to come across Cains in this world. Some people are going to hate you just because that is how you choose to go about your life. You see, now John's original audience were often going to find themselves persecuted at the sharp end of social ostracization because they were not worshipping the Greco-Roman pagan deities. So they would find themselves outside of polite society and sometimes paying a high or even the ultimate price. Now, that's probably not going to happen to any of us. But I'm sure maybe you can think in times in your Christian life or journey or whatever life has taken you where you've done the right thing and you've had to pay a price for it. Because you see, if you're operating around people who have the Cain mindset, and that's the source of their life. They're circling that drain of hatred and hatred for others and self. Then they are going to hate you because you're trying to live and do the right thing, and you're holding up that mirror. And they can't stand it. And so they'll have a go. Maybe they'll malign your character. Maybe they'll lie about you. And they'll say that you did things that you didn't do, because they're trying to make the problem of you shining that light on them go away. And you know what? God honors that. That shows that you've done it. Winston Churchill said that people don't like you, good. It means you've stood for something in your life. There's that validation in the scriptures. And I don't think we talk about this enough, because sometimes we just hand it out like a platitude that, you know, the scripture, the New Testament says you'll be hated because you belong to me, according to Jesus. We need to actually give some credence to the fact that that is evidence of the love of God flowing in someone's life, is that they're wanting to do what is right, that they're wanting to show love and honor, even to a great costliness. And so if you find yourself and you're able, sometimes that can feel like a lonely place and a desperate, and it can leave us questioning, have I done the right? Is it so often people who do the right thing, they're the ones who are questioning because they're self-reflective, because they're actually concerned about how they make their way through the world. And their concern isn't primarily themselves. They're thinking, have I honored God? Have I honored other people? And I think if you have been thinking about that and you're in that position this morning, God would say to you, yes, you have. And you're highly honored in heaven, and you're well thought of by God. And good on you for doing the right thing. Now, ultimately, these in many ways are not the main characters in the story, because where we're really supposed to find ourselves is at the center of this little chunk is Jesus Christ. In verse 16, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Ultimately, this is what everything that we have and are comes down to in life, according to John, is to find ourselves in that place. You remember how I started by saying that John is concluding that God has demonstrated his light, his love, and his life through the person and the work of Jesus Christ. His astounding invitation to the people who are listening to him is saying, Why don't you find yourself in that beautiful circle of the light, love, and life of God swirling around? Why don't you find yourself right in the middle of that? And you're invited to that, because as we consider that and we consider the source of our life and what motivates us and what helps us make the decision whether to give away or to hold back, or the condition of our hearts, or whether we give affection or praise or not, is here's an invitation to you. God loved us so much that he did not wish to see us stay in the source of darkness and circling the drain of hatred and continued conflict. And he decided to make peace with us and help us make peace with one another. Now, that was enormously costly to Jesus Christ. That cost him his life. But he did it so that you could find yourself then centered in this. And that is not difficult, and that bit is not complicated. That is a simple act of faith, is to go, I've had enough of circling the drain of self-preservation, of jealousy, of envy, of greed, of hatred of myself and others. And I need to find a source of life that is inherently better and more pure than that. And all we're asked to do is to believe that he actually did that for us, to place ourselves in the very middle of that. I hope you can hear the invitation where he says, come and find something better, because that's the system the entire world around you runs on. And all it leads to, year after year, is one conflict after another, continued destroyed families and relationships and all kinds of mess. But there is a sanctuary from that. And you are invited to come. All you have to do is believe that he did that for you. And then, you're invited to take up your cross and follow God. And you might be thinking, well, I don't know if I'm ready to give everything into that. I don't know if I can meet the demands, because I know Jesus does in the gospel make demands of people. Listen, nothing is better than finding yourself in this. Do you know why? Because you can get out of a game that you can never win. The cycle and the source of pollution, of greed, envy, self-hatred, others' hatred, pride, jealousy, all of that, you can never win that. You'll be like the man in Ecclesiastes 5 at the end, where you try to acquire as much love and affection, or whether it's money or adoration or praise or attention, and store it all up, and you'll find it never satisfied you, and you will die the same as everybody else and not be able to take it with you, and it won't work. And John is trying to save us the trouble. He's saying, consider whether that is the source of your life and jump ship now. Because, here's the thing, being planted in the source of God's love, light, and life, it actually is enough. You'll actually find this wellspring in your life where the sacrifice that you're called to of taking up your cross and following Jesus, it won't actually in a real sense feel like a sacrifice, because you will know you have an endless supply of the love and the favor and the affection of God himself, and you never have to worry about running out. Do you see? Because love is often in short supply in our world, as much as real love, costly love like this, as much as we talk about it. But if you know that you are connected and planted to the very source of that, and you can tap on as much of it as you ever want, then you never have to worry again about giving anything away. Why? Well, let's sum up our whole series and think about that from a material point of view. Why do you never have to worry about it materially? In its essence, because your Father in heaven, as Jesus said, owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He is the God who has made the entire creation. He is the God of providence who provides for that entire creation. And you have a guarantee and a promise, not that you will always be rich or wealthy. You might fluctuate between states of that, but you have a promise that you will always be in the center of his care. And he will give you what is ultimately best and most meaningful and truly good for you, even if you can't see that at times. And then if you think about the condition of your soul and your affections and the love that you're able to give out, you'll be able to give an endless supply. Why? Because you have an endless supply. You never have to worry about that or being accepted ever again. And so wealth and worship, things, they're all of a piece for John, And he's saying, do not allow yourself for a minute longer to be pulled along in the stream and in the riptide of the wealth and the worship of wealth and the hoarding of either wealth or affections or whatever it is within your own heart in this world. Because that way lies hatred, murder, and ultimately the death of your own soul. But come and taste and experience the light and the love and the life of God, and you will live forever. May God bless His word to us this morning. Amen.